Your African mom was right. Never eat the neighbor's food. Ife didn't listen, and now she's a billionaire, but her bank account is dripping with the blood of her own husband. She's the world's biggest hair mogul, selling silk and sea to the elite, but those aren't just extensions. They're shackles. She traded the man she loves for a global empire, and you're about to find out exactly why her daughter's eyes glow in the dark. Don't scroll, because you might be wearing her contract right now. Welcome to the Wanderer's Tales. Thank you for joining us. Uncover forbidden love, shocking secrets, and stories that defy tradition. When finished, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you. The air in the Acacia suburb was thick with the scent of humidity and the approaching rain, but through the heavy atmosphere, a sharper, more intoxicating aroma drifted from Mama Chinidu's kitchen. Ife was only 9, her stomach a hollow pit of childhood hunger that ignored the echoing voice of her mother, who had spent years drumming a single, terrifying rule into her head. Never eat the food of this world that does not come from my hand, for some pots are seasoned with the tears of the innocent and the salt of the deep. Her mother's warnings were always vivid, filled with stories of village people who used jollof rice as a hook to drag children into the spiritual abyss. Yet as Ife stood by the rusted gate, the scent of Mama Chinidu's Ifo Rairo, rich with locust beans, smoked fish, and the dark, glistening oils of spinach, was more real than any ghost story. The neighbor, a woman with eyes that seemed to hold the stillness of a pond, beckoned Ife with a small, chipped ceramic bowl, the steam rising like a beckoning finger, promising a taste of something that Ife's own humble home could never provide. She felt a shiver of rebellion, a sudden, sharp desire to be more than the cautious daughter of a fearful woman. And as her fingers closed around the warm ceramic, the very ground seemed to thrum with a low, vibrational frequency that only she could hear. With the first spoonful, the world didn't collapse, but it certainly shifted on its axis, the flavors exploding against Ife's palate with a richness that felt almost violent in its intensity. It wasn't just food, it was an invitation, a sensory contract signed in palm oil and spice that washed away her mother's frantic prayers and the dusty reality of their small bungalow. As she swallowed the tender pieces of tripe and the perfectly seasoned greens, a strange coolness began to spread from her core outward to her fingertips, a sensation of being submerged in deep, sunless water, even as the Nigerian sun beat down on her shoulders. She didn't notice that the birds in the nearby mango tree had gone silent, or that Mama Chinidu was watching her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a look of profound, patient ownership. By the time Ife scraped the bottom of the bowl, her eyes had taken on a subtle, iridescent sheen, the first mark of a girl who had traded her ancestral protection for a seat at a table she didn't yet understand. She walked back home, the taste of the sea lingering on her tongue despite being miles from the coast, unaware that the woman in the kitchen was already whispering her name to the shadows, marking her as a new vessel for the marine kingdom that waited beneath the waves. The dreams began that very night, not as the fragmented nightmares of a child, but as vivid, cinematic experiences that felt more tangible than the threadbare sheets of Ife's bed. She found herself standing on a beach of black sand, the sky overhead a bruised purple, and the waves crashing with a rhythmic sound that whispered her name in 1,000 overlapping voices. There was no fear, only a profound sense of belonging, as if her small, earthly body was merely a costume, and this watery expanse was her true home, her true inheritance. Figures emerged from the foam, beings of shimmering, impossible beauty, their skin the color of polished mahogany, and their hair flowing upward like ink in a glass of water, defying the laws of gravity and wind. They didn't speak with mouths, but with the pressure of the tide, telling her that she was chosen, that the village people her mother feared were merely the gatekeepers to a kingdom of infinite wealth and power. When she woke, her pillow was damp with salt water, and the smell of the ocean was so strong in her small room that she had to throw open the window to let the smog of Lagos mask the scent of her transformation. As the weeks turned into months, Ife's physical presence began to change, her movements becoming fluid and graceful, her skin developing a glow that no soap or cream could explain. Her mother watched her with a growing, frantic desperation, recognizing the signs of the waterborne. The way Ife would stare into a basin of water for hours, the way her laughter sounded like the clinking of shells, and the way she had become suddenly, unnaturally lucky. Money started appearing in odd places, under her mattress, in the pockets of her school uniform, and the neighborhood boys who used to tease her now followed her with a dazed, almost hypnotic devotion. Her mother took her to every prayer mountain and deliverance service she knew, but while the pastor shouted and the congregation sweated under the zinc roofs, Ife felt only a distant, amused pity for their efforts. The salt was already in her blood, and the Marine community had already begun to weave their influence through her, preparing her for the day she would officially step through the veil. She learned to hide her visions, to mask the glowing symbols that appeared on her palms when she touched water, becoming a master of the double life before she had even reached puberty. The transition from a girl who had merely tasted the forbidden to a woman who belonged to the deep occurred on the eve of her 13th birthday, beneath a moon that hung over the Atlantic like a heavy, silver coin. The initiation was not a noisy affair of drums and dancing, but a silent, crushing descent into the true hierarchy of the world, led by Mama Chinidu, whose form seemed to shimmer and dissolve in the moonlight until she appeared more like a column of moving water than a woman. They walked past the sleeping shanties of Bar Beach, moving toward a stretch of coastline where the waves didn't just break against the sand but seemed to reach out with longing, sentient fingers. As Ife stepped into the surf, the water wasn't cold. It was welcoming, a thick, viscous embrace that pulled her deeper into the blackness where the light of the stars could no longer penetrate the heavy pressure of the salt. Below the surface, the air she breathed was replaced by a liquid light that tasted of iron and ancient memories, filling her lungs with the power to see the architecture of the Marine Kingdom, a sprawling, iridescent metropolis of coral spires and sunken gold that defied every law of human engineering. Here, she was presented to the Queen of the Seven Currents, a being of such terrifying, radiant symmetry that looking at her felt like a physical weight against Ife's chest, a presence that demanded not just worship, but total spiritual assimilation into the Coven's cold, oceanic logic. The covenant was etched into her soul not with ink, but with the specific, rhythmic pulse of the tide, a contract that promised her the world in exchange for a piece of her humanity every 10 years. The Queen spoke in vibrations that echoed through Ife's marrow, explaining that the beauty she would possess and the wealth she would amass were not gifts, but loans from the deep, and the interest was paid in the currency of those she held most dear. You shall walk among the dry ones as a goddess of silk and light, the voice vibrated, and they will flock to you like gulls to a fishing boat, offering their admiration and their destinies for a chance to touch the hem of your grace. But the price was clear. Every decade, the kingdom would claim a sacrifice, specifically, the man who held the greatest claim to her intimacy, the one whose heartbeat was most synchronized with her own. Ife, still caught in the intoxicating rush of the power coursing through her veins, agreed with the reckless confidence of youth, believing that she could simply remain unattached, a cold island of success that no man could ever truly inhabit. As she emerged from the waves, her hair was no longer the coarse, dry texture of her childhood, but a flowing, obsidian river that felt like spun silk, a physical manifestation of the marine essence she would soon market to the world's most desperate and beautiful women. The first decade arrived with a quiet, predatory grace just as Ife turned 19, a time when her mother's health began to fail in a way that defied every medical explanation and every frantic prayer whispered in the village churches. Ife watched as the woman who had tried to save her became a husk, her eyes turning a milky white like the scales of a dead fish, her breath smelling of the very salt that Ife now used to season her own rising fortunes. It was a cruel irony that the first payment was not a man she loved in a romantic sense, but the man's substitute, the maternal protector whose presence was the only thing tethering Ife to the moral world she had already begun to abandon. The night her mother passed, The room was filled with the sound of phantom waves crashing against the walls, and Ife felt the silver cord of her childhood snap with a violence that left her emotionally hollow and terrifyingly free. She didn't mourn with tears. She mourned with a cold, calculated ambition, realizing that the grief was merely a fuel, a necessary shedding of her former self, so that the Silken Sea Empire could be birthed from the ashes of her domestic life. The marine community watched from the shadows of the water jars in her house, satisfied that the girl who ate the neighbor's soup was finally becoming the predator they had designed her to be, a woman who understood that in the kingdom of the deep, love was nothing more than a liability to be traded for leverage. With her mother gone and the first debt settled, Ife found that her touch had become transformative, her hands capable of weaving hair extensions that seemed to possess a life of their own, glowing with a luster that could not be replicated by any synthetic process. She moved to the heart of Lagos, opening a small boutique that quickly became a shrine for the city's elite, a place where the air was always 10 degrees cooler and the scent of expensive ozone lingered in every corner. She discovered that by infusing the hair with the intent of the marine kingdom, she could create a product that didn't just enhance a woman's beauty, but actively altered her aura, making her irresistible to the men she sought to conquer. Each bundle of hair sold was a micro-contract, a tiny anchor dropped into the souls of her clients, connecting them to the same dark, oceanic source that fed Ife's own bottomless hunger for status. She was no longer the frightened girl from the Acacia suburbs. She was a master of the soft life, a term the world used for luxury, but which Ife knew was actually the fluid, yielding nature of a predator that could drown you in a spoonful of honeyed promises. Her first taste of international success came when a celebrity from London wore her signature salt wave to a red carpet event. And suddenly, the name Ife was being whispered in the salons of Paris and the penthouses of New York as the woman who had discovered the secret to eternal, captivating allure. The formal launch of Silken Sea as an international brand was less of a business opening and more of a spiritual coronation, held in a glass-walled ballroom overlooking the Lagos Lagoon, where the water seemed to ripple in applause. Ife stood at the center of the room, draped in a gown made of shimmering, translucent scales that caught the light like a school of fish turning in unison. Her presence so commanding that even the most powerful billionaires felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to bow. The brand was built on a lie that felt more real than the truth, that the hair was ethically sourced from untouched coastal temples, when in reality, it was woven from the very essence of the marine coven's influence, harvested during the new moon. Every strand of hair was treated with a proprietary blend of minerals that Ife channeled during her midnight meditations, ensuring that anyone who wore the Silken Sea brand would experience a sudden surge in confidence, luck, and a strange, recurring dream of the ocean. The psychological hold she began to exert over her customers was absolute. They didn't just want the hair, they needed it to feel whole, creating a cycle of dependency that saw Ife's bank accounts swell with the kind of wealth that could buy entire city blocks. She was the architect of a new kind of vanity, one that was rooted in the supernatural and sold as a commodity, making her the most sought-after woman in the global beauty industry within a few short years of her mother's passing. Behind the scenes, the operation was a marvel of dark efficiency, where Ife employed hair weavers, who were actually minor initiates into the marine mysteries, women who understood that they weren't just making products, but crafting vessels for spiritual infiltration. The Lagos social scene became Ife's playground, a sea of big girls who wore her hair like a badge of honor, unaware that with every brush stroke, they were inviting the influence of the Coven into their homes and their marriages. Ife moved through these circles with the detached grace of a shark in a koi pond, observing the petty dramas of the elite with a sense of profound, quiet superiority, knowing that she held their very destinies in her hands. She curated an image of mystery and untouchable elegance, rarely giving interviews and never revealing the source of her glow, which only served to heighten the frantic demand for her brand. She was the queen of a shadow economy, trading in the invisible threads of desire and destiny. And as the orders poured in from London, Dubai, and Tokyo, she realized that she had successfully scaled the Marine Kingdom's influence across the face of the earth. The silk and sea logo, a stylized wave merging into a lock of hair, became a symbol of a new era of African luxury, one that was as beautiful as it was dangerous, and as deep as the ocean from which it had been birthed. The expansion into the Western markets required a level of strategic brilliance that Ife performed with a chilling, preternatural ease, opening flagship stores in Mayfair and Soho that felt more like cathedrals than retail spaces. In these cities, the hair was sold at prices that made even the wealthy blink, yet the waitlist grew to include royalty and icons of the silver screen, all of whom were drawn to the vibration of the silk and sea products without knowing why. Ife traveled the world in a private jet that she had christened the Current, her life a blur of five-star hotels and exclusive galas where she was toasted as the new face of global entrepreneurship. But even as she sipped vintage champagne and clouds, she could feel the pull of the water growing stronger, a constant, low-frequency hum in the back of her mind that reminded her she was never truly alone, and that her success was merely a tool for a larger, more ancient agenda. The hair was a conduit, a way for the marine spirits to bypass the traditional boundaries of geography and culture, planting their seeds of influence in the hearts of the women who shaped the world's trends. Every time a silk and sea wearer appeared on a magazine cover, the Coven gained another anchor in the collective consciousness of humanity, expanding their territory beyond the shores of Africa and into the very center of global power. The wealth Ife accumulated was so vast that it began to lose its meaning, becoming merely a set of numbers on a screen that she used to further the Coven's reach, purchasing coastal properties and maritime interests that gave her people more access to the physical world. She watched as the international elite fell under her spell, noticing how the women who wore her hair for long periods began to develop the same fluid movements and cold, iridescent eyes that she had first seen in Mama Chinidu. It was a slow-motion invasion, a soft power takeover of the world's most influential circles, where the silk and sea brand acted as both the uniform and the initiation rite for a new class of water-touched elite. Ife was the pivot point of this transformation, the human face of an inhuman tide, and she played the role of the glamorous CEO to perfection, even as she felt her own heart hardening into a piece of polished coral. She was careful to maintain the no-love rule, treating the men who pursued her with a polite, glacial indifference that only served to make them more obsessed with her, their desire providing yet another layer of energy for her to harvest. She was at the pinnacle of her power, a woman who had mastered both the material and the mystical, unaware that the second decade was drawing to a close and that the spirits were already preparing the stage for her next encounter. The true genius of Ife's empire lay in the dream-weaving effect, a phenomenon where the women who wore her most expensive hairpieces began to experience vivid, recurring visions that they mistook for their own subconscious desires. These dreams were always the same, a feeling of weightless freedom in deep blue water, the promise of hidden knowledge, and the sight of Ife herself, appearing as a guide or a sister in the depths. It was a recruitment process that felt entirely organic to the victims, a calling that bypassed their rational minds and spoke directly to their most primal instincts for power and belonging. As the visions became more frequent, these women, the wives of politicians, the CEOs of tech giants, the influencers with millions of followers, began to seek out Ife not just for hair, but for counsel, sensing that she was the key to unlocking the world they saw in their sleep. Ife became a spiritual gatekeeper, a high priestess of the modern age who used the vanity of the beauty industry to build a global coven of big girls who were willing to trade their peace for the soft life the Marine Kingdom offered. She was no longer just selling hair. She was selling an evolution, a way to become something more than human in a world that felt increasingly small and mundane. This dark side of the beauty industry was Ife's greatest secret, a hidden curriculum of empowerment that required a slow, systematic erosion of the wearer's traditional beliefs and moral foundations. She watched with a quiet, predatory satisfaction as these women began to detach from their families and their pasts. their priorities shifting toward the service of the Coven and the expansion of the Silk and Sea influence. The recruitment was by choice, but it was a choice made under the influence of a supernatural thirst that Ife had carefully cultivated, a hunger that only she could satisfy with her specialized treatments and rituals. She was a puppeteer pulling the strings of 1,000 high-profile lives, her influence rippling through the corridors of power as her daughters began to make decisions that favored the Coven's long-term goals. The Marine community was pleased. Their reach had never been this extensive, and their influence had never been this subtle, all thanks to the girl who had once been hungry enough to ignore her mother's warnings. Ife, however, was starting to feel a strange, hollow ache in the center of her chest, a residual human feeling that she couldn't quite drown, a premonition that the next decade would demand a payment she wasn't sure she was ready to make. Despite her global stature, Ife still found herself drawn to the raw, electric energy of the Lagos high society parties, where the wealth was loud and the spiritual undercurrents were always simmering just beneath the surface of the champagne. It was at one such event, a masquerade gala held on a private island, that she first saw Zara, a woman whose aura was so bright and complex that it stood out even in a room full of silk and sea initiates. Zara moved with a double shadow, a spiritual weight that Ife immediately recognized as favor, but it was a kind of favor she had never encountered before. The simultaneous devotion of two powerful men who seemed to cater to her every whim without jealousy or conflict. As Ife watched, she saw the way Zara's husbands, one a titan of industry and the other a high-ranking political figure, moved around her like twin moons orbiting a planet, their energies perfectly synchronized to her needs. It was a double destiny, a rare spiritual configuration that granted Zara a level of protection and abundance that even Ife, with all her marine power, found herself envying with a sudden, sharp intensity. The curiosity gap was wide. Ife needed to know how a dry woman had managed to secure such a powerful, balanced grip on the physical and spiritual realms at the same time. Their meeting was inevitable, a collision of two forces that seemed to recognize the shadow in each other. And as they spoke, Ife realized that Zara's secret wasn't just luck, but a different kind of contract, one that Ife felt a sudden, irresistible urge to possess for herself. Zara's invitation to an exclusive night of party for those who live between the worlds was the hook that Ife couldn't refuse, her ambition clouded by the desire to add Zara's double favor to her own burgeoning arsenal. She was fascinated by the idea of having two sources of devotion, two streams of energy to harvest, and she began to plot how she could use her charms to steal this destiny away from the unsuspecting woman. It was the first time Ife had acted out of pure, petty greed rather than the Coven's directives, a human mistake that would set the stage for her own eventual undoing. She didn't see the irony in her envy. She was a goddess of the deep longing for the simple, grounded devotion of the earth, and in her quest to steal Zara's light, she was inadvertently opening the door to the very emotion she had been warned to avoid. As the gala ended and the moon set over the lagoon, Ife prepared her most powerful charms for the coming party, unaware that she was about to walk into a trap of her own making, one that would lead her directly to the man who would become her greatest joy and her ultimate ruin. The invitation did not arrive by courier or through the sterile ping of an encrypted email. Instead, it manifested in the center of Ife's penthouse as a pool of iridescent condensation that had gathered on her mahogany desk, smelling of ancient salt and expensive, crushed gardenias. As she touched the liquid, the water didn't wet her finger, but rather climbed her skin like a living vine, unfolding into a shimmering, holographic map that pulsed with a rhythmic, subterranean violet light, pointing toward a secluded cove in Victoria Island that appeared on no official GPS. This was Zara's world, a realm where the soft life wasn't just about private jets and designer labels, but about the manipulation of the very fabric of reality through the favor of the twin husbands who served as her spiritual anchors. Ife felt the competitive hum of the marine kingdom vibrating in her teeth, a primal urge to witness the source of this double favor, and perhaps find a way to weave it into the fibers of her own burgeoning empire. She dressed in a gown of liquid mercury that seemed to flow against the wind, her hair, the crown jewel of silk and sea, cascading down her back in a dark, torrential river that held the captured light of 1,000 sunken stars. She knew that tonight was more than a social engagement. It was a reconnaissance mission into a different kind of power, a challenge to the oceanic dominance she had spent a decade cultivating with blood and silence. As she stepped into her waiting limousine, the driver, a man whose eyes were permanently clouded with the gray film of the water-blinded, didn't need an address. He simply drove toward the scent of the coming storm, weaving through the chaotic Lagos traffic like a ghost through a graveyard. Ife watched the city pass by, the neon lights of the clubs, the desperate hustle of the street vendors, the crumbling colonial architecture, and felt a profound, chilling detachment from the human struggle that surrounded her. She was a creature of the deep now, a woman who measured time in decades and debts. Yet the mystery of Zara's dual devotion tugged at a vestigial piece of her curiosity that she thought she had drowned long ago. The invitation whispered of a party of phantoms, a gathering where the masks people wore were their actual faces, and their true selves were left at the door in exchange for a night of impossible, supernatural indulgence. Ife adjusted her necklace of raw, black pearls, each one a tear shed by a minor sea deity during her initiation, and felt the power of her coven rise to meet the challenge, her ambition sharpening into a lethal point as she approached the hidden gates of the island. She was Ife, the Silk Queen, and she would not allow another woman to possess a light that she could not replicate, harvest, or eventually steal for herself to fuel the next stage of her global ascent. The venue was an architectural impossibility, a glass and basalt pavilion that seemed to hover just inches above the churning surface of the Atlantic, where the waves crashed with a sound like low, rhythmic chanting. Inside, the party of phantoms was a sensory overload of modern African luxury, filtered through a lens of ancient, occult geometry, where the guests moved with a synchronized grace that suggested they were all being puppeteered by the same unseen hand. Zara stood at the center of the ballroom, flanked by her two husbands, one a man of iron and industry, the other a man of silver and law, who moved with such perfect, selfless devotion that they seemed less like individuals and more like two halves of a protective circle. The air was thick with the scent of burning frankincense and the ozone of high-voltage magic, and as Ife moved through the crowd, she could see the shadows of the guests, not dark silhouettes, but vibrant, glowing entities that revealed their true spiritual rank. Here, the big girls of Lagos didn't just gossip about fashion. They whispered about the price of souls, the exchange rates of destinies, and the specific rituals required to keep their husbands under a permanent, honeyed thrall of adoration. It was a marketplace of the intangible, and Ife, with her silk and sea aura, was recognized immediately as a top-tier trader, a woman who had commodified the very essence of the marine kingdom for a global audience. The party peaked at midnight, when the music shifted from a deep, tribal house beat to a haunting, oceanic frequency that made the glass walls of the pavilion vibrate with the intensity of a tuning fork. Zara approached Ife, her eyes glowing with a double iridescence that spoke of two souls feeding into one vessel, and offered her a glass of wine that looked like liquid gold but tasted of a woman's deepest, most secret longing. As they spoke, Ife realized that the double favor was a rare alignment of the stars and the tides, a spiritual jackpot that allowed Zara to bypass the usual sacrifices required for such immense wealth and protection. The jealousy Ife felt was cold and sharp, a jagged piece of coral in her heart that demanded satisfaction. She couldn't stand the idea of Zara having two shields while she had to stand alone as the sole target of the Marine Kingdom's hunger. Around them, the phantoms of the elite danced with abandon, their bodies blurring into streaks of light and shadow, creating a vortex of energy that Ife knew she could hijack if she were bold enough to strike. She began to weave a subtle, silken charm between her fingers, a web of hair-thin energy designed to latch onto Zara's destiny and pull the threads toward her own, a theft of light that would change the trajectory of her life forever. In that moment of high-octane magic, Ife forgot the warnings of her mother and the laws of the Coven, consumed by a human greed that was far more dangerous than any marine entity. The ritual of theft was as delicate as detangling a knot in $1,000,000 weave, requiring Ife to match the vibrational frequency of Zara's double luck while simultaneously maintaining the icy facade of a socialite. As they touched glasses in a mock toast to sisterhood, Ife released the siphoned silk, a microscopic strand of spiritually charged hair that she had harvested from her own scalp during the height of a blood moon, letting it drift towards Zara's throat. The moment the strand made contact with Zara's skin, it didn't burn. It anchored a psychic hook that began to drain the extra favor from the woman and channel it back through the floor, through the salt air, and into Ife's own spiritual reservoir. Ife felt a sudden, violent rush of heat, the sensation of having two lives, two protectors, two destinies, pulsing through her veins like a drug, a feeling of absolute, unassailable safety that she had never known as a child of the suburbs. Zara didn't collapse. She simply seemed to dim, her movements becoming a fraction slower, the light in her eyes flickering like a candle in a draft as the double favor began to peel away from her soul like wet parchment. The husbands, sensing the shift but unable to articulate the source, grew restless, their protective circle tightening in a frantic, instinctive attempt to guard a treasure that was already being systematically looted by the woman smiling in front of them. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, bleeding a bruised orange into the gray Atlantic, the theft was complete, and Ife felt like a giant standing among ants, her aura now so bright it was nearly blinding to those with the sight. She left the party without a word of goodbye, walking across the bridge back to the mainland with the stride of a conqueror, her shadow now unnaturally thick and casting a double image on the pavement. She had stolen the twin luck, the ability to be loved by two worlds at once, and she felt an arrogant certainty that she had finally outsmarted the Marine Kingdom by securing a secondary source of energy that didn't require their permission. What she didn't realize, in her state of spiritual intoxication, was that stealing a destiny of double favor meant she had also stolen the requirements of that destiny, the need for an anchor that could hold the weight of two worlds. The theft had created a vacuum in her soul, a space that was now primed to be filled by something she had spent her entire life avoiding, a genuine human attachment that would defy the logic of the sea. She returned to her penthouse and slept for 3 days, dreaming not of the ocean, but of a man with eyes like warm earth and a voice that didn't vibrate with the tide, a man who was already being drawn into her orbit by the gravity of her newly stolen luck. With her stolen destiny augmenting her natural power, Ife's silk and sea brand underwent a transformation that was nothing short of miraculous, the hair now possessing a magnetic quality that made its wearers the center of every room they entered. The recruitment phase began in earnest as Ife launched the Empress Collection, a series of bespoke hair installations that were sold only to a curated list of the world's most powerful women, each piece a literal gateway to the Marine Kingdom's influence. These women didn't just buy hair, they bought a transformation, agreeing to follow a set of lifestyle protocols that Ife had designed, midnight salt bath, specific meditations, and a commitment to the sea state mindset that slowly eroded their ties to their traditional lives. As they wore the hair, the visions Ife provided in their dreams became more frequent and more realistic, showing them a world where they were no longer bound by the laws of aging, poverty, or consequence, as long as they remained loyal to the brand. This was the Coven's true expansion, a global network of big girls who were effectively being initiated into the Marine community without ever realizing they were trade-ins for Ife's own decade-long debt. The revenue from this collection alone was enough to buy a small nation. But for Ife, the money was merely a byproduct of a sheer, addictive rush of seeing her influence spread across the globe like an oil slick on clear water. The psychology of the recruitment was masterful, playing on the deepest insecurities of successful women who had everything except the one thing the marine kingdom offered, a sense of total, unshakable divinity. Ife acted as the high priestess of this new religion of vanity, hosting silk retreats on private islands where she would personally bless the hair of her top clients, cementing their spiritual bond to the water and to her own stolen destiny. She watched as these women, who once controlled the boardrooms and political stages of the world, began to look at her with a terrifying, cult-like devotion, their eyes reflecting the same iridescent sheen that had once marked Ife as a child. She was building an army of sirens, a force of nature dressed in Chanel and Dior, who would ensure that the marine kingdom's interests were protected in the halls of power for centuries to come. Yet, even as she reached the zenith of her professional and spiritual influence, Ife found that the Silken Sea empire was becoming a prison of her own making, a world where every interaction was a transaction and every face she saw was a mirror of her own cold ambition. The stolen double favor was starting to itch beneath her skin, a restless energy that demanded a target for its affection, leading her to wander the streets of Lagos in disguise, looking for something, anything, that felt real in a world made of shimmering, expensive illusions. It was during one of these incognito wanderings, in a rain-slick corner of a small art gallery in Anakin, that Ife encountered the unforeseen variable that would dismantle her carefully constructed world, a man named Emeka. He wasn't a billionaire, a politician, or a spiritual predator. He was an architect of the old school, a man who built things out of brick, mortar, and truth, with hands that were calloused from work rather than smooth from rituals. When he looked at Ife, disguised in a simple cotton wrap and a plain wig, he didn't see the Silk Queen or the Marine Goddess. He saw a woman whose eyes held a profound, hidden exhaustion, and he spoke to her with a gentleness that didn't seek to harvest her energy or her influence. For the first time in 20 years, Ife felt her spiritual defenses falter, the double favor she had stolen from Zara reacting to Emeka's presence with a warm, grounding hum that felt like coming home after a long, cold journey at sea. He talked about the way the light hit the old Brazilian quarters of Lagos, about the integrity of a well-built foundation, and about the beauty of things that were meant to last rather than things that were designed to dazzle and disappear. Ife, who had built her entire life on a foundation of shifting water and stolen luck, found herself captivated by his solidness, by the way his laughter didn't sound like the tide, but like the crackling of a safe, domestic fire. Emeka was the antithesis of everything the Marine Kingdom stood for. He was humble, he was honest, and he was profoundly, stubbornly human in a way that Ife had forgotten was possible. He challenged her without even trying, his very existence a silent critique of the glamorous, hollow shell she had become, and Ife found herself returning to the gallery night after night, drawn to him like a moth to a flame she knew would eventually consume her. The unforeseen variable wasn't just his personality, but the fact that the stolen destiny she carried wanted him. The double luck was designed to anchor to a man of substance, and in Emeka, it had found the perfect vessel. As they walked through the streets of Lagos, eating roasted corn from a roadside vendor and talking about the future, Ife felt the cold, oceanic logic of her life beginning to melt, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating vulnerability that she couldn't control. She tried to tell herself that he was just another recruitment, another source of energy to be harvested, but her heart, that piece of coral she thought was dead, began to beat with a rhythmic, human heat that signaled her doom. She was falling into the one trap the Queen of the Seven Currents had forbidden, the one error that would turn her empire of silk into a shroud of salt. She was beginning to fall in love with a man who had no place in the world beneath the waves. The fall was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, excruciating erosion of Ife's spiritual armor. As every hour spent with Emeka made the Silken Sea rituals feel more like a chore and less like a coronation. She began to cancel high-stakes meetings and ignore the summons of the Coven, preferring the simple, unadorned reality of Emeka's small studio where the air didn't smell of ozone and salt, but of sawdust, coffee, and the possibility of a different life. The no-love rule, once a cornerstone of her survival, now felt like a heavy, rusted chain around her neck, and she found herself lying to the marine spirits, masking her emotions with a layer of cold, synthetic indifference that was starting to crack under the pressure of her growing devotion. She knew the clock was ticking. The 9th year of her second decade was drawing to a close, and the kingdom would soon come to claim the most slept-with man as their payment for her 20 years of absolute power. The irony was a jagged blade in her side. By stealing Zura's double favor, she had made herself twice as capable of love, and therefore twice as vulnerable to the heartbreak the Coven required as their ultimate currency. She looked at Emeka as he slept, his face a map of a world she wanted to inhabit, and felt a crushing, visceral dread as she realized that she was grooming the very sacrifice that the ocean was already preparing to harvest. The internal conflict became a physical sickness, a fever that made her see the saltwater phantoms even when she was with him, their silent, accusing eyes reminding her of the bowl of soup that had started it all. She tried to push him away, to return to the cold, glittering embrace of her international empire, but the double favor acted as a magnet, pulling them back together with a force that defied her most powerful charms. Every kiss was a betrayal of her coven. Every shared secret was a nail in the coffin of her husband-to-be, and yet she couldn't stop herself from diving deeper into the very intimacy that would eventually destroy him. She realized that the silken sea brand was no longer her pride, but her shame, a monument to a girl who had been so hungry for the world that she had forgotten how to live in it, and she began to desperately search for a loophole in the ancient, oceanic contract. She visited Mama, Chinidu's old haunts, consulted with the shadow weavers of the lagoon, and pored over the hidden ledgers of the marine kingdom, looking for any way to trade her empire, her beauty, or her very soul to save the man who had given her back her humanity. But the laws of the deep are as immutable as the moon, and as the day of her wedding to Emeka approached, a lavish, global event that she had planned as a final, desperate act of defiance, she knew that the crack in her armor was too wide to mend, and that the sea was already rising to meet her at the altar. The wedding of the century took place under a canopy of white orchids and reinforced glass on the shores of Eco-Atlantic, a location that was as much a statement of human defiance against the sea as it was a celebration of Ife's union with Emeka. To the world, it was the crowning achievement of the Silk and Sea Queen, a merger of beauty, architecture, and unimaginable wealth. But to Ife, every "I do" was a spiritual shackle tightening around her throat. She wore a gown woven from the rarest silver-threaded silk, a fabric that shimmered like the surface of a calm lagoon, yet she felt the weight of the stolen double favor pressing against her ribs like a physical burden. Emeka stood at the altar, the embodiment of everything the marine kingdom despised, a man of solid earth, whose love was a simple, radiant force that didn't require a contract or a sacrifice to exist. As the priest spoke of eternal bonds, Ife saw the shadow guests standing at the edge of the surf, beings of salt and foam who didn't applaud but waited with the patient, terrifying silence of creditors watching a debt accrue interest. The air in the pavilion was unnaturally cold, the scent of expensive lilies fighting a losing battle against the brine and the ozone that drifted in from the dark water, reminding Ife that her wedding wasn't just a beginning, but the official commencement of the countdown to her second decade's payment. The reception was a blur of high society toasts and champagne that tasted like copper to Ife, her senses tuned to the vibrations of the deep rather than the music of a live band. She watched her clients, the big girls of Lagos and London, dancing in their silk and sea extensions, their movements becoming more fluid, their eyes more iridescent, realizing she had successfully terraformed the global elite into a subsidiary of the Marine Coven. Yet, her heart was anchored to the man spinning her across the dance floor, whose warm hand on the small of her back was the only thing keeping her from dissolving into the saltwater phantoms that beckoned from the waves. The double favor she had stolen from Zara was now a double-edged sword. It gave her the capacity to be loved by Emeka with a ferocity that was nearly divine, but also made the impending loss of that love a cataclysmic event that would shatter her soul into 1,000 jagged pieces. She whispered her own secret vows into the crook of his neck, promises of protection and defiance that she wasn't sure she could keep, while the Queen of the Seven Currents watched through the eyes of the decorative fish in the towering centerpieces. By the time the last guest had left and the moon was high, Ife realized that her marriage was a beautiful cage, and the man who held the key was the very person she had already, by the laws of her initiation, sentenced to a watery grave. The arrival of her children, two beautiful daughters with skin like burnished mahogany and eyes that held the depth of the Mariana Trench, turned Ife's world into a battlefield of conflicting loyalties. Motherhood was supposed to be the ultimate dry experience, a grounding in the cycle of life and legacy. But for Ife, it was a terrifyingly wet paradox, as her daughters were born with the mark of the marine kingdom already etched into their spiritual DNA. They didn't cry for milk. They hummed in a frequency that called the birds to their nursery window, and their first steps were taken with a grace that suggested they were walking on water rather than the expensive hardwood floors of their Ikoyi mansion. Emeka saw only the miracle of their beauty, unaware that the double favor he provided was being harvested by the Coven to fuel the children's unnatural growth and spiritual acuity. Ife watched them with a mixture of adoration and horror, realizing that they were not just her daughters, but potential successors to her dark throne, high-level initiates in waiting who would one day have to face the same choices she had made over a bowl of soup. The mansion became a sanctuary where the air was constantly humming with the energy of 3 waterborne females, a domestic ecosystem that was increasingly alienated from the human world Emeka tried so hard to maintain. The paradox grew as the children flourished. The more Ife loved them, the more she felt the marine kingdom's grip on her life tightening, as the Coven used the children as leverage to ensure her continued compliance with the expansion of the Silk and Sea brand. She found herself caught in a cycle of repaying the children's health and beauty with more aggressive recruitment of her clients, turning her business into a global engine of spiritual indoctrination to keep the spirit's hunger away from her nursery. Emeka, ever the architect of foundations, began to sense the structural instability of their lives, noticing the way the water in their home behaved strangely and how the children seemed to speak a language that didn't belong to any earthly tribe. He tried to ground them in the culture of his ancestors, taking them to the village and teaching them the stories of the land, but Ife could see the saltwater phantoms following them even there, whispering that the land was merely a temporary platform above the true world. The internal war Ife fought was exhausting, a slow-burn agony of being a mother who wanted to protect her children from the very source of her own power, while knowing that the second decade was nearing its end. She began to realize that the most slept-with man rule wasn't just a punishment for her. It was a test of whether she would choose the terrestrial love of a husband over the aquatic survival of her lineage, a choice that left no room for compromise. As the 9th year of the second decade began to bleed into the 10th, the physical and spiritual atmosphere around Ife started to disintegrate, the ticking clock manifesting as a constant, low-frequency roar in her ears that no amount of luxury could drown out. The Silk and Sea Empire was at its absolute peak, with flagship stores in every major city and a valuation that made Ife one of the wealthiest women on the planet. Yet she was becoming a ghost in her own life. Her skin began to feel perpetually damp, her breath always smelled of brine, and the double favor she had stolen from Zara was starting to backfire, creating a gravitational pull that drew the marine spirits into her home with a frequency that was becoming impossible to hide from Emeka. The Coven no longer sent whispers. They sent demands, appearing in the reflections of her mirrors and the surfaces of her children's bathwater, pointing toward the calendar and the man who slept beside her every night. She began to experience temporal skips, moments where she was physically in a boardroom in London, but spiritually standing on the black sand beach of her initiation, the Queen of the Seven Currents reminding her that the loan of her soft life was coming due in full. Every minute she spent in Emeka's arms was now a sensory countdown, a desperate, frantic attempt to memorize the texture of his skin and the sound of his heartbeat before the Atlantic claimed them as its own. The psychological toll was visible in the way Ife began to obsessively manage the Silk and Sea brand, as if by making it more powerful, she could somehow use its sheer economic weight to buy her way out of the contract. She launched the Infinity Weave, a product so spiritually potent that it promised its wearers not just beauty, but the ability to stop time, a desperate reflection of her own desire to freeze the world before the final year concluded. Emika, seeing her descent into a state of high-functioning madness, tried to intervene, suggesting they leave Lagos and retreat to a quiet life in the hills of eastern Nigeria, away from the water and the business that was consuming her. Ife laughed, a sound like glass breaking under the pressure of the deep sea, knowing that there was no away from the Coven, no mountain high enough to escape the reach of the entities she had invited into her blood. The children, sensing the shift, became increasingly strange, their drawings filled with images of a man falling into a dark, swirling vortex, their innocent play acting out the tragedy that their mother was desperately trying to rewrite. The ticking grew louder, vibrating through the floors of their mansion and the hulls of Ife's private jets, a rhythmic reminder that the sea does not negotiate. It only waits for the tide to turn and for the debt to be collected from the shore. The realization hit Ife like a tidal wave on a Tuesday morning, a day so mundane and sunny that the horror of it felt almost obscene as she looked at a photograph of herself and Emika from their wedding day. The most slept-with man rule was not a metaphor or a poetic cruelty. It was a biological and spiritual math that pointed with unerring, cold precision to the man who had been her only intimate partner for nearly 10 years. In her pursuit of a normal life with Emika, in her refusal to take other lovers or engage in the shallow dalliances of the elite, she had inadvertently made him the most valuable currency in the Marine Kingdom's ledger. She had thought that by being faithful, she was being human, but in the logic of the Coven, she was simply fattening a sacrifice, concentrating 20 years of favor and stolen destiny into a single, earthly vessel. The double favor she had stolen from Zara hadn't protected her. It had only doubled the intensity of her attachment to Emika, making his eventual loss the most potent sacrifice the Queen had ever received. The genius of the trap was breathtaking, a long-game strategy that had used Ife's own rebellion and her own heart as the instruments of her destruction, ensuring that her ultimate payment would be the one thing she truly couldn't afford to lose. She locked herself in her sensory deprivation tank, a luxury item that she now used as a communication portal, and demanded an audience with the entities that had raised her from the suburbs of Ikeja. The water in the tank didn't just hold her. It spoke to her, the vibrations informing her that the sacrifice of Emika was the only thing that would ensure her daughter's safety and the continued prosperity of the Silk and Sea global network. A life for a life is the law of the dry ones. The voices hissed through the liquid. But a destiny for an empire is the law of the deep. You chose the Silk, you chose the sea, and now you must choose who remains on the shore. The cold logic of the Marine community was absolute. They didn't care about her love, her children's heartbreak, or the structural integrity of the life she had built. They only cared about the harvest of a soul that had been marinated in the double favor of two worlds. Ife emerged from the tank with her eyes no longer iridescent, but a flat, dead black, the realization hardening into a desperate, feral resolve to find a loophole, even if it meant tearing the world apart to find it. She looked at Emika across the dinner table that night, her mind a frantic machine calculating spiritual exchange rates, while he talked about a new project, a coastal library that would stand for 1,000 years. Unaware that his own life was being measured in hours and breaths. Ife's desperate search for a loophole led her back to the very place she had tried to forget. The dusty, superstition-heavy villages of the interior, where the village people her mother had feared kept the ancient secrets of how to break a marine contract. She traveled in a convoy of armored SUVs, her silk and sea glamour feeling like a heavy, mocking costume as she walked through the red dust of her ancestral lands, seeking out the oldest, most weathered mouthpieces of the earth deities. She offered them millions in cash, gold, and even the infinity weave hair, But the old men and women looked at her with a pity that was more devastating than any curse, recognizing the scent of the deep that had already claimed her soul. "You ate from a neighbor's bowl," one blind elder whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping on a tombstone. "And you stole the favor of the twins. You have built a house of water on a foundation of salt, and there is no earth magic that can dry a debt that has been signed in the blood of the heart." She tried to trade her entire empire, the brands, the real estate, the private jets, offering to go back to being a nameless girl in the suburbs if they would only take the mark from Emeka. But the spirits of the land turned their backs, refusing to interfere in a contract that was already 20 years old. The search then turned inward and downward, as Ife used her most forbidden charms to descend into the deepest trenches of the Marine Kingdom, seeking an audience with the Old Ones who predated the Queen of the Seven Currents. These were beings of pure pressure and bioluminescence, entities that didn't understand the concept of a soft life and only spoke in the language of tectonic shifts and oceanic currents. She proposed a trade. She would initiate every single one of her millions of clients, turning the world's elite into a permanent, visible colony for the deep if they would only allow Emeka to remain on the shore as a witness. The Old Ones considered the offer, their vast, cold intelligences weighing the value of 1,000,000 shallow souls against the concentrated, double-favored soul of a man who truly loved a goddess. The answer came not in words, but in a sudden, violent surge of the tide that nearly drowned her in her own penthouse, a clear signal that the harvest of Emeka was a non-negotiable requirement for the next decade of her existence. She returned to the surface broken and hollowed out, realizing that the only way to save him was to destroy herself, or the only way to save herself was to become the very monster her mother had warned her about. As the final sun set on the 10th year, she drove Emeka to the same beach where she had been initiated, the double favor humming a mournful, final tune as the Atlantic rose to meet them for the last time. The final shore was a stage set for a tragedy of mythic proportions, the Atlantic Ocean churning with an unnatural, bioluminescent fury as the clock struck midnight on the final day of the second decade. Ife stood at the water's edge, her silk and sea extensions whipping in the gale like the tentacles of a giant, obsidian creature, her hand gripped tight in Emeka's as he looked at the waves with a confused, growing terror. He still didn't understand the full scope of the debt, only that the woman he loved was glowing with a terrifying, unearthly light and that the ground beneath his feet was turning to liquid salt. The Queen of the Seven Currents emerged from the foam, a towering figure of crystalline water and ancient malice, her hand outstretched to claim the most slept-with man, whose heart was the only anchor Ife had left in the human world. In that moment of absolute pressure, Ife looked at her husband, the architect who built foundations, and then at her daughters who stood a few yards back, their eyes reflecting the shimmering, cold kingdom that was waiting to swallow their father to ensure their own survival. The choice was a razor blade. Save the man who gave her a soul, or save the daughters who carried her blood and the empire that gave her a throne. With a scream that was both a human cry and a whale's song, Ife didn't push Emeka into the waves. Instead, she used the double favor she had stolen from Zara to perform a final, forbidden act of spiritual inversion. She channeled all the luck, all the wealth, and all the silk and sea energy she had amassed over 20 years into Emeka, turning him from sacrifice into a sanctuary, a being so saturated with her power that the ocean could not touch him without reclaiming Ife herself. She stepped into the waves in his place, the contract satisfied not by his death, but by her total, permanent immersion into the Coven as their eternal, mindless servant, a trade that left Emeka on the shore with their children, but without a wife. As the water closed over her head, Ife felt this soft life dissolve into the cold, crushing reality of the deep, her last human thought being the warmth of Emeka's hand and the hope that her daughters would never eat from a neighbor's bowl. Emeka stood on the beach as the sun rose, a man who possessed the world's greatest fortune and a destiny of double luck, but whose eyes were forever fixed on the horizon, waiting for a woman made of silk and salt who would never return to the dry land. The silk and sea brand continued to flourish, led now by the two daughters who grew to be more powerful than their mother. But the story of the girl from the suburbs became a hushed warning whispered in the salons of Lagos. That some foods are too expensive to taste, and some destinies are too heavy to carry back to the shore. So, be honest. Would you sacrifice your soulmate for $1 billion and eternal beauty? Most of you are judging Ife, but half of you would sign that contract in a heartbeat. If you think she was right to choose her daughters over her husband, comment silk. If you think she's a monster, comment salt. Oh, and tag that one friend who's always eating at the neighbor's house. You might just save their life.